Değerli misafirler, 14. Türkiye Enerji Zirvesi'nin ikinci gününe hoş geldiniz. İkinci günümüze özel bir sunumla başlıyoruz. Enerji piyasalarının geleceği, hükümet müdahaleleri devri. Bu sunum için Piyasa Temel Analizler Birim Başkanı Enerji Aspex'ten MOSIS'i sahneye davet ediyorum.
Hey, good morning. It's a little early today. Hope you're doing all right. You had breakfast. We have a lot to go over this morning. My name is MOSIS. I'm with Energy Aspects, head of fundamentals at Energy Aspects. As part of the company, I try to make sure that we have a global, integrated view of what's going on in the global markets. I joined Energy Aspects after a number of years in government. Most recently, I was at the White House, where I was director for energy markets on the National Security Council. Before that, I was Department of Treasury Secretary Yellen's advisor for energy issues. Perfect, thank you. Today we're going to talk a little bit about politics and how politics have a major role in energy markets, much more than they did at any other time in history. So, what I have for you on the screen here today is, in orange, we have US oil production. In blue, we have the price of WTI, and I've highlighted for you a number of points where there have been major policy actions. Over the last decades, I'd say about 15 years, up until the invasion of Ukraine, we have seen governments have a very strong push towards deregulation. They've wanted markets to do what they want to do, tried to push them to grow as they grow. But what we have seen in the last couple years is the complete opposite. Concerns about climate change, concerns about security of supply have pushed governments to take a more interventionist role. The big question now is whether governments can do that and do that without disturbing and distorting markets. So let's start with sanctions. In the US government, sanctions are some of the most used tools that we've seen to try and influence markets. A good example actually just happened 2 days ago, and it was mentioned yesterday by a few of you. Gazprom Bank was sanctioned by OFAC. Raise your hand if you know who Gazprom Bank is. Anybody here? There we go. The major seller of Russian gas. Without Gazprom Bank, there's no way to buy Russian gas, right? So you would think at face value that this sanction would make it so that Russia can no longer sell its gas to buyers. But in reality, if you dig a little bit deeper, there are loopholes, right? There's this thing called General License 8 by OFAC, which lists a number of banks, including VTB and Sberbank, where you can still use them to buy, to transition finances to Gazprom Bank. What I'm trying to say here is that during the Biden administration, we have seen a number of very, very powerful sanctions tools put in place, but repeatedly, those tools have not been used to their advantage. They have not been used in a way that have any impact. Why is that? I'll tell you personally, I've sat in the rooms in the White House where the decisions have been made, and there is a consistent fear of disturbing global economic and energy markets. They don't want to make any vibrations. Now, speaking about this one more time because it affects Turkey, and you'll see still a big chunk of Turkish natural gas supply comes from Russia. General License 8 that allows for you just still buy gas from Gazprom Bank, that expires in April, okay? Who's going to be president in April? Trumpito. So when Trump is in power, do we think that Trump is going to extend General License 8 or not? We don't know, right? But what we do know, what is for certain, is that if he does not, Gazprom will have a very hard time selling its gas to any buyer, Chinese or European or Turkish. It's irrelevant. Now, what this demonstrates is that governments have the power to impose massive implications on energy markets if they so choose. The Biden team has chosen not to. They've chosen to do as little as possible to actually impact markets while signaling that they care. Trump is going to be different. Very different, actually. Trump won divisively, House, Senate, White House. He's filled his team with loyalists. So there'll be very few checks on his power. You're going to get these slides, so I'm not going to go into this in very much detail because we're going to go into it in a minute. But what I want to say is that it's going to be a very different regime. So what do we have to expect in the next 4 years? First, let's talk about Iran. Iran and China. It's one of the most important things that could impact energy markets. You'll remember in 2017, 18-19, when Trump was in power and he put maximum pressure campaign on Iran, the massive drop in Iranian exports. You remember what that did to prices? You also remember at that time there was a promise by Saudi that they would assist in putting barrels back on the market, right, to offset. But what did Trump do last minute? He changed the terms of maximum pressure, provided some sanctions relief, and the OPEC did not put the barrels on the market. OPEC will not forget that. So when we hear often that Trump, if he comes in power, will reinstall maximum pressure, which we think he will, and we think he will because the people he has put around him in the White House are extreme hawks. O'Brien, Waltz, these are people who believe deeply that Iran deserves to be put in its place. Now, whether you agree or I agree is a different story. It doesn't matter. They believe it. Further, the maximum pressure campaign is not something that, like his first administration, will take 2 years to put in power. I can also tell you from the time that I worked in the White House, there are plans already made to put pressure on Iranian exports. They're on the shelf. They're in a book, gathering dust, right? Nobody really wants to pull them out. But if Trump is willing and ready, which we think he will be, he can pull them out very quickly. So in that environment, we think that Trump will not only, this is not only one of the biggest risks of government intervention in the near term, the very near term, but that the trope that we hear across energy markets that OPEC will step in, offset, is a little bit naive. We expect the OPEC leadership to first see action before doing anything, because they remember the lessons of 2018. What else do we see in the Middle East? We see in Israel a major conflict. What we like to think about when we look at the Israel-Palestine, Israel-Gaza, Israel-Hezbollah conflict is green light, red light, yellow light. And what we see coming from the Trump team is a yellow light. What's that mean? Go and do what you got to do before I get into power. Get things done. Trump wants to end wars. We all agree he wants to end wars, right? It doesn't mean he wants to end them without major incident. What we expect to see happen, what we are warning is in the next 6 months until Trump comes into power is the highest period of risk and volatility because Biden's a lame duck, Trump isn't in power yet, and we expect Trump to be nodding to the Israelis to do what they need to do. Now this brings me back to the previous slide where you could see a conflict in the Middle East reduce oil exports, but you will not see an immediate offset by OPEC. Now finally, Russia-Ukraine. What defines government policy, what defines the way governments react to foreign policy is not who the president is per se, but it is who he surrounds himself by. What we've seen in this administration so far, unlike the first time Trump was in power, is the people that he has put in positions of authority, A, have strong beliefs in something, and 2, have experience in getting those things done. Not everywhere. There's some weirdos, like the guy who took over the EPA. Don't tell him I said that. But there are also some very experienced people in power who have agendas, including on Russia. And the idea that we will see Trump push for an immediate end to the Russia war on day one is again naive. I want to take you back to the idea that under the Biden administration, there were a plethora of tools that were built, sanctions tools that were built that were not used. The price cap, you guys all know about it, never used, never enforced, but could be used, could be enforced to great effect. Same with many of the export of technology and financial sanctions, sovereign asset sanctions. All these tools are in place to be used to put pressure on Russia, and we believe that Trump will be cognizant of that. We do not think it's highly unlikely, given the people he surrounded himself with, that this will be a one-sided push for negotiation. Instead, there'll be pressure on both sides to find a settlement that both agree on. And for energy markets, it almost means nothing. Have we seen Russian exports decline? In fact, no, we've seen them increase, right? The only thing that we may see happen are two things, one positive, one negative. One is if you start to see the imposition of the price cap, you may start to see a redirection of flows. You may start to see a decline in the premium for Russian commodities. Number two is if you see Ukraine find themselves stuck in a corner. What does a rat do when it's in a corner? What's a cat do when it's in a corner? It lashes out, right? What could Ukraine do that it hasn't done just yet? It could shift its offensive strategy towards Russian export facilities. We've seen so far it's held back from doing so, right? It's only targeted Russian facilities that are geared towards domestic supply and military supply. That is not necessarily the case if they decide they are desperate. Now that could very, very, very quickly impact Russian exports. So what about Trump domestically? We know, as an energy industry together, that Trump is pro-energy, right? Drill, baby, drill. But besides drill, baby, drill, we'll see deregulation, we'll see methane regulations rolled back, we'll see support of things like CCS permitting, we'll see support for things like pipeline reform. But the reality is, U.S. production doesn't have much more to push out. If you take a look at the chart on the left, that's U.S. production and our forecast. And we're pretty conservative. If you look at some of our competitors, we're the best, by the way. But if you look at some of our competitors, they have an even worse expectation for U.S. production growth than we do. That means that no matter what Trump does, there's very little more U.S. production he can goose out. Gas, oil ratios out of key basins in the U.S. are becoming gassier. That means for every barrel you produce, you get more gas. That means you need somewhere to put the gas. You need pipelines to take the gas away. That's a difficult task. Second, if you take a look at some of the largest growth that we've seen in the Permian this year, the Permian being the workhorse of U.S. gas production, it has not come from Tier 1 acreage. It's come from Tier 2 acreage. What's that tell you if you're a geologist? That means the field is starting to lose its power, right? So when we look at U.S. production change, we'll take a look on the right there, we actually think that U.S. production growth peaks towards the end of this decade. And we'll start to see a decline in U.S. production, a plateau, really, for a number of years before a decline. That means despite all this that Trump wants to do, there's little he can do to increase, really increase oil production, because it's not a policy thing. It's a geology and a capital discipline thing by companies. Now, let's turn to Europe. What we've seen in Europe is not much different. It's only on steroids. We've seen European policymakers take aggressive action to try to push forward a climate agenda. One of the best examples is heat pumps. So we've seen heat pumps materially impact gas demand growth over the last 4 years, and we think it will continue to do so. But there's an impact to this at the same time. That is power demand. How do you power a heat pump? Electricity. How do you power an EV? Electricity. So just as we are seeing gas demand decline because of heat pump increase, because of European subsidy support and regulation, we're seeing an increase in power demand, and there's a difficulty in getting that power. So where's that power going to come from? Supposedly, on the right you'll see large renewable build-out will support that power. That renewable build-out is supported by subsidies, of course, right? So you've all heard about negative power prices. You've heard about days when there's where there's more renewable power generation that can be consumed. This will have the corollary effect of declining gas demand, as you see on the left there. But what that also means for you in the gas industry is extreme volatility in gas prices. Solid-state batteries aren't a thing. Hydrogen will never happen. So what that means is you're always going to need gas as a backup for your days of peak demand. And that can be priced how you want to price it. This will create massive volatility in gas markets, gas and power markets, completely driven by subsidies. Now, this is happening alongside Europe's China problem. Europe is trying to push through all of these subsidies, all of these reforms, at the same time that it's trying to compete with Chinese manufacturing and have its own domestic economic crisis. Have you guys seen the latest IP numbers out of Germany? They're terrifying. Have you seen support from Macron? Terrifying. What that tells you is that from an economic perspective, Europe is struggling massively. And Europe has put its eggs in the basket of energy transition. It's done so at the same time that the driver of the energy transition, China, as you'll see on the left, can do everything exponentially cheaper. And the EU is not making it easy for itself, right? Have you guys heard of the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism? This is a policy that will likely that we are seeing rolled out by European policymakers that makes it harder to import goods from abroad because of carbon leakage abroad, right? So that will make this even more expensive on the left. I will tell you, from my time in government, CBAM is being taken very seriously by the US administration. That's a new one. 5 years ago, nobody was talking about it. But what this altogether means is that the Chinese government has taken a totally different approach than the US and the European governments have. If you noticed recently, we saw a slew of policy announcements come out of Beijing, economic policy announcements. Unlike the US, where the Fed is independent, Chinese interest rates are quasi-independent, right? They're driven by what Beijing needs to see happen. So what we've seen in the last 2 years, as we have seen Chinese economic slowdown, is a rapid decline in key interest rates to try to goose the economy. This is the Chinese government being very active in trying to support its market. At the same time, when we talk about security of supply, there's no more pro-EV, electric vehicle government than China. We have seen EV sales in China rapidly increase. We've seen LNG truck sales in China rapidly increase. Both of these aimed at reducing the reliance on foreign oil. Now, the reliance on foreign oil is an interesting one, right? We often think about Saudi Arabia as the home of spare capacity, right? Saudi has all the spare capacity, UAE has all the spare capacity. I like to think of China as the home of refining spare capacity. If you take a look at the chart on the right, you will see utilization rates for the lines are the utilization rates for Chinese refining facilities. Now, there are many different kinds of Chinese refining. There are the majors, the ones owned by the governments. That's the red in the bottom. It's the key one. The blue, the teapots, these are small independents. And then, well, these are small companies that operate kind of outside of direct government control. And then we have the independents on the top. You'll see that in both cases, these refineries operate well below their maximum refining capacity utilization rates. Why do they do that? Couple reasons. One, security buffer. Say we have a trade war tomorrow, and Russia can't, and Europe can't import, China can't import what it needs for refined products. They have spare refining capacity. More importantly, they are trying to squeeze out some of these less efficient refineries. What's another way they're trying to squeeze out these less efficient refineries? Export quotas. Do you guys remember about 2 years ago when diesel was pricing at $110 a barrel, $120 a barrel, right after Russia invaded and everybody was freaking out? What would have been the quickest solution to that? Chinese export quota increases. Suddenly all their spare capacity would have been allowed to increase because export quotas, which the government provides refiners, were to increase. That's why I say China is the home of spare capacity for refining. They do this nominally so that they can meet their domestic clean air targets. But at the same time, we have to remember that every time China releases their export quotas for the year, markets react immediately because the amount China exports of refined products will directly impact global refined product balances and margins. This does not mean that China's done building refining capacity. In fact, Chinese refining capacity strategy is becoming more refined, if you will. Excuse the pun. What we are already seeing is Chinese refining capacity shift towards large petrochemical focused refining facilities. That means less clean products, more petrochemicals. About 8 years ago, Saudi had this saying that they were going to go further and further down the hydrocarbon chain. That meant they were going to get into petrochemicals. They've tried, Jazan for example, but China is doing the same thing. And the difference in what we have in China is that when Beijing says something, it gets done, right? So we expect to see petrochemical facilities increase, refining facilities aimed at petrochemical production increase across major Chinese refining centers. This is happening at the same time that in the US and the EU, tons of pressures, be it climate requirements, be it capital discipline requirements, be it ESG requirements for publicly traded companies, are forcing or leading refineries to shut down. I could show you a similar chart for the US that shows you refining capacity consistently decreasing over the next 6 years because of these factors. Now, what does that do? That increases the dependence on Chinese export quotas, that increases the dependence on Chinese spare refining capacity, as I told you about a minute ago. These are going to be major factors as we think about the next 5 years, 6 years. And some of these factors actually cannot be impacted by any government in the West. It will be very, very, very, very, very difficult for Trump to convince tomorrow somebody to Shell, for example, or BP, to put the money into building a refinery in the US. Now, it's not just about oil. It's also about gas. We have seen both, and we're going to see in the next 6 years a massive flip in the gas industry. In Qatar, we're seeing export capacity nearly double. In the US, we're seeing export capacity nearly double. And during this period, what we expect to see is both of these centers of growth lead to a convergence in global gas prices. That means prices between Asia, Europe, and the US will only be differentiated by shipping prices, shipping differentials, if you will. What does that mean for power? What's that mean for industry? It does reduce the cost of generation. It does reduce the cost of production. But we're going to see some very, very stiff competition. And there's a major difference between Qatar and the US. In Qatar, you'll see that blue area on the top right, that's still not contracted. red area below that is contracted. Almost all of that is under destination restricted exports, right? You have to export where you signed you would export. That's a government control, right? Now, when we look at the US, if you take a look at the right there, sorry, let me go back. If you look at the US, where we're going to see US LNG export capacity double, the mechanism for US LNG exports is free destinations based on Henry Hub, which is much more flexible and allows for optimization on the water. That has made US export capacity very, very attractive, which is funny because Biden suddenly stopped US LNG export development. Again, I was there when it happened. I was very angry. I quit over it. But we will see, I guarantee you, on day one, Trump reverse that policy decision. But the damage is already done, right? If you are looking to invest $20 billion in an LNG facility, are you going to do it in a place where within 3 years of construction, a new president could reverse LNG policy? Probably not, right? So there's a big risk that we don't see any more large-scale U.S. LNG FIDs beyond what's already nearly there. Commonwealth, CP2, they may make it. But there's a deeper problem that we have in the U.S., and that is pipeline capacity. Take a look on the left there. That solid dotted line is Permian gas production. And you'll see it barely covers, up until 2024, Permian gas production. The black line is production, and you will see that the areas below that are export routes. And those export routes barely cover the production in the region. If you cannot take the gas out of the Permian, you cannot produce the oil because you cannot flare the methane. So what we have in the US is a major constraint, policy-driven constraint, because of Biden's rules around methane regulation and flaring, that limits how much oil you can produce out of key basins. This year we expect around 300,000 barrels a day of growth out of the US. A lot of that comes purely because of one pipeline, the Matterhorn pipeline. That pipeline adds more capacity. It allows more gas to come out of the Permian, and it brings together the ability for you to produce oil and get rid of the gas. Now, with all these things in mind, what I want to end with is talking about what I like to call the age of government intervention. I think what we've seen in the last 2 years, and what we'll see more of with Trump in power, and with a Europe that's strategically and powerfully falling apart, is a focus on energy security and away from climate change. And what that means is more policies that impact and distort domestic production, exports, and global prices. What that means for markets is that we need to do more as analysts than build supply and demand balances. We need to follow legislation. We need to understand the people in power, and we need to understand what their motivations are. So I'll end with a pitch for Energy Aspects, which is this is what we do precisely, right? We have a staff of people, 8 people on one of my teams. All we do is follow these factors, and we guarantee you that over the next at least 4 years, but I presume longer, policy will be the driver of some of the biggest volatility and vibrations in global markets. It will not be fundamentals. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm here to speak with you afterwards if you have any questions. Thank you.